So, Jonathan, it's great to have you here. Thanks for coming. Tell us about The Crossing.
Sure. Thank you all again so much for having me. I'm entering my 10th year here at UWF, and it's just everyone's been so welcoming. It's in my job here, I'm director of creative writing, and so I get to work with a lot of wonderful students and to work with them on their writing, and it's nice to have this opportunity to share and talk about some of my own as well. The Crossing is a collection of poems that are all individual poems. It was written over a long time, about 10 years or so. Most of the poems were written over that time period. The way that poetry publication works is that ideally what you have to do is publish all of the poems individually first in literary journals. And so and you send them out individually, and they're accepted or rejected individually. And it takes a long time to do that because the acceptance rate in most journals is pretty low. You know, it's single digits from the material that they receive. So, and the process is slow too. It takes usually several months before you hear back, and then another year or so at least before the issue would come out. So. That has its pros and cons. You know, it's frustrating as a writer. There's no shortcuts, and most book publishers expect, you know, the majority of the poems to appear first to build up a readership. The benefits of that is it forces you into a situation where you essentially have to spend more time working on the poems. It's not, okay, I wrote a book last night and now it's going to be published today by a reputable publisher. And so that even though it's frustrating at the time, that's been really helpful for me to really take the time over the years to do that and to find the most organic shape for the book. The title comes from the title poem of the collection, which is about it's based on a story I came across. The belief, there's a group of individuals, they're called the Taboli. It's a tribe, a Mindanao tribe, and their belief that the soul leaves the body in sleep and then returns to wake it. And then death occurs when the soul leaves permanently. There's an epigraph for the poem that explains that. So that was something that interested me imagistically and visually in the poem. A lot of times when I'm writing poems, and what I'm constantly encourage students to do is to think about how they can take an abstract thought and represent it through imagery. And that has lots of benefits. It allows, first of all, the reader to experience that material and to experience that circumstance. And it also allows the reader to have a sort of a complex, allows you as a writer to have a complex representation of your thoughts and ideas. You know, you can convey in a singular instance a lot of complex connotations to an image. So that's where the title came from. I was trying to imagine that individual poem, and then when you choose a title for a collection, you try to select sometimes a title poem that title resonates beyond just that individual poem. So I was trying to think, well, this is a title that resonates in a lot of different types of crossings, right? You know, there's the crossing between life and death, right? But then there's sort of crossings into adulthood and just the different themes that seem to manifest throughout the book. So that's really where the book and the title came from.
And I hate to ask you to spell out the themes of your book because the work should speak for itself. But if you don't mind, tell me about. You say it took an organic shape.
Sure.
As the poems, you wrote them over the years. Do you mind telling me about how that shape took form and some of those themes?
Sure, Lindsay, be glad to. We have one of the things that I notice a lot of times with students in classes is that there's a tendency when you read a collection or you read a poem and it has very strong thematic content to think that the author, okay, they started with that theme in mind and then they built the poem around it. And a lot of times that can be stifling to you as a young writer because it creates the impression that the author knew everything that they were going to say or everything that was going to happen beforehand. When really what I know my attention is on when I'm writing, and my students and many of my peers when they're writing, their attention is really on an impulse, a feeling. It's on a line by line, word by word selection. And so when you're following that trajectory, a lot of the thematic material starts to take care of this take care of itself and grow organically from that attention of the writing process. I see this all the time in class, where students, many times I'll ask them to accumulate at the end of the semester all of their poems that they've written and to put it together in a book, right? And these are poems that were written, some in response to my assignment, some in that individually that are an outgrowth of their own interests and things. And they'll initially say, well, I can't accumulate any of these things. They're completely disparate material. And then they sit down and then they realize, oh my gosh, all of these are about my mother, right? Or that they're all about thematic material, that they see continuity they didn't necessarily intend. And I think that that's a natural progress in their work, and also that's what I felt here. The specific themes, the things that I see, one thing that's nice after a while, you are able to look back at a lot of the material that you've written, and you see the imprint of your own obsessions and interests and thematics that come together. So, a lot of the themes here is just about, I would say, just the nature of desire and all of its implications. I would think a lot of the themes here are just about just the nature of life and death, and I want the poems to be as experiential as possible, and that's both in the content of understanding kind of the stories and the plots and that material, but also as experiential in the musicality of the language and in the rhythms and all of those things.
Well, I have several follow-up questions to that, but one
Sure.
that I have written down was to talk a little bit about forms versus free verse, because I noticed that your next book is going to be sonnets, and that you have some formed poems in this collection, but some not. And then with the musicality, so that's part A, and then part B would be, you mentioned musicality, and one of the things I really enjoyed about your poems was the internal rhyme and the approximate rhymes and things like that.
Great.
And so maybe if you could speak about reading and speaking poems.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you so much for reading the book so closely. That's sort of attention to those components. I find, in addition to writing poetry, I also write like nonfiction and some immersive essays and things like this. And so, the more that I write, I tend to think about how you're drawn towards a subject matter, or something intrigues your interest, that you feel intuitively or intellectually that there's something you want to write about in that material. And you don't always know what form that's going to end up taking, whether it's a specific type of formal poem, or it's a free verse poem, or it's an essay. Many times I'll start out with something in mind, and then it'll transition over the writing process into a different form. So much of what I'm trying to do in the writing process is to find the right form for that material. With specific formal poems, it's Seamus Heaney, the Nobel laureate poet, who is a wonderful poet, and he talks about poetic form as both ship and anchor, right, at the same time. And he means traditional, I think, both traditional form, but also the form in which it's constructed, even if it's not a traditional form. And I think that's certainly true, because it creates a tension in two directions. On one hand, it feels like a compression, right? Controlling. Like if I had free range, I would just write as much as I wanted, but this form is constricting me in one sense. At the same time, it also creates forward movement. A lot of times when writers are experiencing writer's block, that they'll return to traditional forms because it gives them a sort of structure and a movement forward. At its best, what you hope for when writing formal poems is that, first of all, that form is invisible. That the reader, will appreciate it, can read it. And, we do this in class a lot. We'll read a Shakespearean sonnet or something, and you can talk and spend the entire class period talking about just the content of it, and then you go back and say, oh, well, wait a minute, this is the structure of the poem, and it's been invisible. It's been supporting the piece all along. So that's that, and also when formal poetry helps you. It helps you break your rhetorical patterns, right? You could think of a musician that is constantly doing the same kind of runs in their vocal or instrumental performances, and then you say, okay, well, you can't do that anymore. You have to search out a different language, and in the best case scenario, it makes it more unique, less rote in that. So these poems, quite a few of them are specific formal poems. A lot of them are what's written in what's called blank verse, where you have it's iambic lines, but I don't have a set number of syllables per line, but it still is an iambic. You could scan it throughout.
So how do you as a jumping off point, then, that seems to me as that you must be in a school of thought that poems are meant to be spoken, shared aloud, and not just read on a page.
Sure, one of the wonderful things about poetry is that your body is the vehicle for its creation or expression, right? If you're a violinist, the violin becomes the component of expression, right? That you're translating your experience through. In poetry, your physical body becomes the conveyance for that experience, because it's carried on your voice. So you're speaking the same words that people before you spoke when you're reading traditional poems, and there's a lot of power to that. On a practical level, whenever I'm writing, in order to try and get those rhythms right on the page and the sounds of it, I'm talking through these things as I'm writing, and so it's, some poets sit down to try and memorize their work, or they look at, but I think that just that reworking nature of it is what, in speaking through it and talking through it, it becomes almost ingrained. You see this in revision too, because I don't know if this is your experience when you're writing something on the page, but sometimes there'll be a typo in there or something small in there, and that you've stated it or said it so frequently that your mind literally doesn't pick it up off the page. And somebody will look at it and say, okay, you're using THERE rather than THEIR or something like that. And it's fascinating how your mind just looks over that, because you're so accustomed to speaking it and saying it.
Mm-hmm. That just as an aside, I have a master's degree in theology, and I once wrote an entire paper where I accidentally said apocalyptic instead of eschatological, the entire paper, and my professor was incensed, and I was literally, my mind was totally gone. So that's funny that you said that. So what drew you to poetry as a form? And especially, I noticed that you have I did read some of your essays, and I almost thought in some of them, the phrase that came to mind was that you're like a literary journalist, that there's something about the journalistic and what you do. So what intrigues you about that, and also what drew you to poems?
Sure. I came to poetry first before getting into essays. A lot of the essay work came out of my teaching here at UWF and my experience with students, and I'll talk about that in a second. Really what drew me to poetry, I had wonderful benefit. My father's an English professor, a teacher. My mom is a musician, so we were always surrounded by the arts growing up. And so that always seemed very natural as a pathway that one could follow, I think, and to have models for that and to be able to attend readings and things. So that was always a real benefit to have such a loving family that would support me along those lines. What drew me to poetry specifically is I always enjoyed multiple things. Like I went into college considering engineering. I always liked math and science. I always liked those sort of structural things. But I always enjoyed music too, and just narrative. That's one of the things that you realize is that when you get older, you start to see the world narratively. That's kind of how I see everything as a writer. Well, what is this sequence of events, and what is it going to lead to? How does one action anticipate another? And so all of those seemingly disparate things were all things that poetry could provide a space to explore, right? So as you're writing, I always warn students it almost creates a schizophrenic mindset, because your attention on the page is to the imagery and the sounds and the structure and all of those things going on simultaneously in a poem, which I think it's unique among art forms, that it allows those layers of attention. And that's also the pleasure of it, that it's the frustration of it, but it's the pleasure of it is when all those things are working together. I heard a poet say once, you want all of your horses running at once. And that's the feeling, right? When all those things are working together, is you're in the carriage and all the horses are, sort of going at once. So that's what I'm drawn to in poetry. The nonfiction writing grew specifically out of in my teaching, what I wanted to do, because I teach, I'm director of creative writing, so I teach a lot of the different genres. And in the nonfiction, students would frequently write memoir pieces, which was great. There was certainly a place for that. But I wanted them to kind of get out in the world and experience it more, and to engage the world, you know, in a nonfiction way in their writing. And so I basically built an assignment of what I broadly call investigative nonfiction, which you've identified as the journalistic qualities of that, where they have to have an investigative question that has two clear opposing sides to it, two compelling sides to it, right? They have to look at, it has to be place-based, some place that embodies it. They have to be able to go there. They have to talk to, you know, people representing both sides of the viewpoint. They have to question their own preconceived biases, right? It's not a vehicle just to reiterate, you know, a singular viewpoint. And they have to contextualize it in the larger world, right? So, you know, how is this representative of something else? So I started writing a lot of those essays myself as in that same structure, so I could help address a lot of the things they were thinking about. For example, you know, I grew up in West Texas, so one of the essays I went about to write was about the fracking boom in Midland, you know, and so it's a very simple question, right? You say, well, has this fracking boom been beneficial or detrimental to the city of Midland? And clearly it's both, right? There's pros and cons. You know, there's this influx of capital, but there's also this influx of people from outside. You know, the infrastructure of the city isn't set up to support that, and so that's been a really nice component. And where it fits into poetry is that poetry, in my view, we're so accustomed to language that is argumentative and litigious, right? Like I would argue that's the dominant mode of communication that we experience, where people say, okay, what's your argument? This is your side. You're going to defeat this opposite side, right? You know, support it and defeat your opposition. What poetry allows for is that ambiguity, that space that there are multiple truths happening simultaneously and multiple experiences happening simultaneously. So that's something that I hopefully touch on in different ways, both in the poetry, but also in these investigative nonfiction assignments, in which students are required to write in such a way that they're looking at both sides of an argument as well.
What do you think that people don't know or misunderstand most about poetry?
That's a great question. I think I would say probably one of my frustrations is that a lot of times readers will approach poetry and then they won't understand it. They'll say, "Wait, this feels like a language that is directed towards like a subgroup that I am excluded from." And their response to that many times is to feel frustration themselves, to say, "Oh, there's something wrong with me that I don't understand this," right? And you know what I hope for in writing is that, and this is just my personal interest, is that someone can sit down who has poetic training and can say, okay, you know, I recognize, you know, how this fits into the tradition of writing that precedes it. Right? Simultaneously, I would hope that someone who doesn't come from that background could read the poems and appreciate and understand the surface level of them, the material of them. You know, a lot of times, and I fully, you know, appreciate and understand a lot of the theoretical material that goes into more sort of language poetry or things that someone who doesn't have training in poetry might feel excluded from. For me personally, though, what I feel drawn to is language that allows for both an interaction with both of those groups.
In light of that, what do you think the role of the poet is in the 21st century?
That's a good question. You know, a lot of that changes. You know, the role of the poet. One way that the role of the poet has changed significantly is we're much more embedded in academia now, right? You know, that it's almost become a teaching profession more than anything, and so part of that is like, what's the poet's role within the university, right? And I think that a poet has a lot of, or any creative writer has you know, a very clear role in the university of championing things like the arts and championing the inquiry and the critical thinking that comes with that. In society, I think the role of any writer, of any sensitive artist is constantly fighting against that impulse towards reduction and oversimplification. I think that what the role of the artist is to constantly point out that this impulse to reduce and exclude is an inadequate way of solving problems. That the way that you generally solve problems is you say, okay, look, all of these people have very divergent and equally valid experiences related to some subject matter, and the role of the poet is to explore their material in such a way that it allows for that sort of interaction with the world.
I noticed that a lot of your work deals with historic events, and that's even brought up in the introduction, that the sense of public history. And I was curious, one, for you to talk about that, and two, to say, was that an intersection of your interests prior to coming to UWF, because UWF has this public history, or was that a parallel interest that kind of came together?
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. It's very acute awareness. I was interested in history prior to coming to UWF, but UWF was such a great fit for that interest as well. What I'm drawn to in writing historical material, like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, and some of the other poems in the book, is that I like entering into that imagined space of the other, right, or of someone's historical experience. That is, of course, you're inventing that space, right, as well. It's not biography, right? It's not transcription of their lives. And what's beneficial about that is it allows you a palette of material that sometimes is going to be more compelling to you than just autobiographical material. I'm blessed with having having a loving family and a stable job and all of these things that make for a wonderful life. Not necessarily the most compelling material to read about. So the historical material has writing about historical material has been a really nice entry point into that. You asked a minute ago about the role of the poet. I think the role of the poet is also to build empathy, and I see that with students frequently, because what you're really doing in imagining an experience that is other than your own or an extension of your own experience is that you're creating empathy for someone else. You're imagining someone's life experience outside of your own. And so that's one of the real values of a creative writing classroom, is that students are required to consider a point of view outside of their own experience, or create a point of view, even if it is based on their own personal experience. And then that's something that they take with them into their careers. Even if they don't go on to become professional writers, they're carrying that into their careers of law and medicine and others, for which very, very much needed. What I try to do with the history is I gravitate towards some of the kind of anecdotal or imagistic language to try and bring it down to an individual scale or person scale, rather than sort of the factual information that always frustrated me as a student. And it gives you space to recreate and to imagine the experiences while also staying true to that material. I think where historical writing kind of goes off the rails a little bit is when you can just feel the research basically downloaded into the material. So you have two characters who are walking along the street, and one of them says, well, as you can observe, these are 18th century street lights that are run with this gas thing. And so and you just feel like, okay, the author's downloading researched material into it. But that's how I kind of enter into those spaces.
Has there ever been a piece of that research material that you just really wanted to work in there, but you didn't for that reason?
Yeah, oh sure. That's one of the classic struggles of writing, is that when you're working on a piece of something, like an entire piece, and that there's some component, a singular component of that poem or story or essay, whether it's like a line you really like or a historical anecdote, that ends up being, you like it so much, but it doesn't fit the whole of the structure. Invariably, what happens is you fight back and forth over it, and then you end up just taking it out, and usually try to save those things, and you can generate something else from it. I heard a poet talking one time about how she had a line that she really liked, and she used it as the beginning of 5 or 6 poems and always ended up pulling it out at the end. So she referred to it as her starter. You know, like when you make bread, you know, you have the starter that that's what makes the bread, but then it's not, you know, essentially part of it.
Do any of those details come to mind though, like a specific word, phrase, or?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Well, there's lots of things. In the Triangle Fire poems, especially, there's beautiful language that some of those newspaper articles and others use. There's a specific simile in there that one of the newspaper reporters talked about the scene of the women jumping out of the window, their death, and there's and this was historical in the photographs. There was a man who stood there and was kind of helping them out as they jumped, and then he jumped himself. And there was a line in the newspaper article where he said it was as if he was helping them into a streetcar and not into eternity. Right? You know, so it's this beautiful line, but that for me, you know, and there's Robert Pinsky has a famous poem where he uses that line as well, and there's poetic license. It's a whole debate about whether or not, you know, you can use material like that. For me, I try to steer clear of language that other writers have used, right? So for me, I feel it's appropriate for me to write about that scene because it's historical, but I want to resist like an explicit simile, perhaps like that someone used, you know. But that's all up for debate. You know, poets will debate that. But that's an example of something that I didn't. You know, it's a beautiful line, but I didn't want to bring specifically into the poem.
You sound, especially when you read, like you have that hint of Texas in your voice that you haven't tried to eradicate. Yeah. Do you believe in, like, you mentioned place, like wanting there to be a place space when you're investigating. I mean, is that intentional?
Sure, yeah. My accent comes out, definitely reading when I've had a cocktail or something, definitely comes out more pronounced. You know, I think that's, you know, T.S. Eliot has that great line where he talks about, you know, the goal of our exploring is to return home and to understand the place for the first time, right? And I think that's a very natural trajectory that, you know, everyone goes through, whether that's in an artistic pursuit or in just their personal experience. You know, that you have your personal experience that you grow up in, and then you go out and you explore the world, and you come back to it, and you see it through that lens of those experiences, and it changes it, and you understand, you know, where you're from in a different light. I find that, you know, when you're starting out writing, there's an impulse to say, okay, the artistic world is everywhere except for where I'm at, where I am, where I come from, right? You know, that there's something inadequate about where I come from. I have to go out to find that artistic experience, and then you go do that. There's value in that, in exploring the world around you, and then there's equal value in returning and embracing, you know, devoting yourself to a sense of place. Whether that's, you know, the place of your youth, the place where you grew up, or the place where you currently reside. At least for me, that becomes more fertile than it is than anything else. You know, Flannery O'Connor has a great line where she talks about when you're writing, you know, you can choose what you want to write, but you can't choose what you make live. And I think that's certainly my experience, that a lot of times, you know, that so much of what I tried to do of getting away from the West Texas areas of my youth or my frustration, that's also what lives so much, and I find myself returning to, you know, thematically or narratively in the poems. You know, one of the things I talk with students a lot about, and there's also lots of allusions that come through here, so they're not just sort of the historical material, but referencing everything from like biblical material to myth to others, you know, and one of the things I talk with students a lot about is how when you're writing from an allusion, that you don't want to just reiterate the content of that allusion, right? So you don't say, okay, this poem is a plot summary of Paradise Lost, right? You say, well, okay, you can just go read Paradise Lost, right? And so you have the double benefit. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have a benefit of this rich material to work with, but then you also have to approach it in such a way that you're bringing that material into your own work. So this Prodigal Son poem, this one was one where I've always liked the story of the Prodigal Son, and it's always felt like a much more complicated parable to me than just, you know, simply about the return of the son. And so I was thinking about the material, and in reading it, you know, I noticed that in the story, there are no women referenced or mentioned in the story, right? It's the father and the two sons, and the son goes out and the father comes back. And so I felt like that would be a good entry point into this story. So imagine what, to reimagine it from a perspective in which there are wives and sisters, and hopefully, you talked about thematic concerns, hopefully through that, consider the different ways in which men and women grieve, the loss of individuals, and at least for the context of this poem.
Well, I was going to ask you if you knew any poems by heart you wanted to share.
Oh gosh, boy, that's puts you on the spot. Let's see. I'll try. One of my memories I think a lot about and talk a lot about it was reading in high school, reading Yeats's poem "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death," and being just really drawn to that language and just that space of that a lonely impulse of delight, where he talks about being beyond politics and beyond. It's neither law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men nor cheering crowd, right? And thinking about that as really some of the things I've been drawn to in poetry and trying to memorize. Mm-hmm. I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate. Those that I guard I do not love. My country is Kiltartan Cross. My countrymen Kiltartan's poor. No likely end could bring them loss, nor leave them happier than before. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, nor public men, nor cheering crowd. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seem waste of breath. A waste of breath, the years behind, in balance with this life, this death.
It was wonderful.
Okay, so it's probably some words that I've missed in there.
Okay, so now I have my little lightning round. So just, you don't get to have much time to think. You just have to tell me what you think.
Okay.
Okay, so your favorite book?
Favorite book? I would say Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient.
Your favorite writer?
Oh gosh, I would say my father. How about that?
Your favorite publication?
Do you mean like one to read? Mm-hmm. I would say New England Review.
Your favorite poem?
Favorite poem?
Of the moment.
I would say I will go with Robert Frost's Birches.
Least favorite cliche?
Least favorite cliche? I would say, I'll pass on that one. I'll come back.
Okay, well, your next question is your favorite cliche.
Okay, okay. Okay, for favorite cliche, can I talk for a second about it? Okay, good. In the Yeats poem, one of the things that you hear in there is a rhetorical structure called a chiasmus, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's an A, B, the B, A, right? We hear these all the time. Right? Ask not what your country can do for you, you can do for your country. So my favorite cliche, growing up, speaking of West Texas, was the one that said, football coaches used to yell at you all the time. It's not the size of the dog in the fight; it's the size of the fight in the dog, mm-hmm. right? So that's probably my favorite cliche.
Okay.
I like that one a lot. Most unfavorite cliches are the ones that are just are intended to obfuscate circumstance, right? So like a lot of kind of political language, things like people say, oh, well, there's significant collateral damage, right? You say, oh, well, it's just collateral damage, right? And that's the whole intent of that kind of prefabricated cliche language is to misrepresent the reality of what's taking place.
Okay, so euphemism, sort of.
Yeah.
Your favorite music to write to?
None, absolutely none. That's a really complicated question because, in one sense, poems are complemented so much by music in one way, and they're similar in so many ways. But at the same time, what you're trying to do as an artist is to create the musicality in the language itself. So sometimes having an exterior component will undermine what you're trying. So it's quiet.
Do you write longhand or type?
I type now. I do it all in the word processor. Yeah.
Your favorite all-time album?
Oh, gosh, that is a good question. I'll have to come back to it. I don't know.
Okay, well, you only have one more then before you have to come back.
I'll say Graham Parsons, Grievous Angel.
Say it again.
Graham Parsons, Grievous Angel, that one.
And your favorite public radio program?
Oh, I like, Car Talk was great before those are gone. Yeah, I like all of them. But This American Life is probably my favorite.